To start? Welcome, everyone. This panel on the Bible and climate change as the 20th anniversary of Bill McKibben's book, The Comforting Whirlwind, is the first of 4 ecological hermeneutic sections at the Society of Biblical Literature. So even though it says AAR up here in big letters, we are the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature. We are very, very grateful to the American Academy of Religion and especially to President Lori Zoloff for bringing Bill McKibben here and to making climate change the central theme of this entire conference. I hope that the Society of Biblical Literature will also take up this theme and make it central to our work in subsequent years as we consider the important messages of the biblical text and the richness that we have there to speak to this crisis. We're grateful today for Bill McKibben and his amazing work on behalf of the climate crisis. Yes, let's just think. His book, The Comforting Whirlwind, was published in 1994. And it's one of many, many books he's written on ecology, of course, in addition to his many articles in Rolling Stone on the climate math and much more. But what is so important about this book is it's explicitly biblical. It's about the book of Job and specifically God's speech from the whirlwind in Job 38 to 41. It first came out with Eerdmans and has now been republished by Cowley, and it's available in the exhibit hall in the Roman and Littlefield booth, and there's flyers about it on the back table. Cowley has been bought by Roman and Littlefield. God's speech from the whirlwind in Job is actually one of several creation accounts in the Bible and one of the most intriguing, demonstrating amazing attention to scientific observation and detail. And you will hear about that from our panelists today, 2 of whom are Old Testament scholars, Ted Hiebert and Kathryn Schifferdecker, and one of whom is an activist and scholar, more, who will bring in the New Testament. With questions like God's question to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the world?" God is reminding Job that Job is not the creator of the world. But I must say personally, what struck me most in 1995 and in subsequent years about Bill's reading of the book of Job is in fact the haunting fact that for the first time in human history, because of climate change, we now have to answer differently to what are supposed to be rhetorical questions that God asks of Job. Questions like, do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on earth? The answer is supposed to be no. Job is supposed to answer no, but for the first time, Bill points out, we have to answer yes. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? Again, these are rhetorical questions to which we should answer no. But the scary thing is now that we've entered the Anthropocene, this new age that geological stratigraphers are telling us is the case, for the first time we have to answer yes to these questions because humans are now the dominant force in shaping nature. This is what his book takes up in eloquent and poetic ways. When I was a geology student as an undergraduate, we learned the geological eras and epochs with acronyms like "Come over someday, maybe play poker," which stood for Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. And then 3 jacks covers 2 queens, or 3 jars of candy was for the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And the era we were living in, this was in the 1970s, we were living in what was called the Holocene, which is part of the Cenozoic era. But since I graduated from college now, geologists and stratigraphers say that we've entered a new geologic era, this Anthropocene, and it's scary. So the whole question then is, how do we read biblical texts in the Anthropocene, which was not the age our biblical writers lived in? The good news that we hear in Bill McKibben's work and the work of our panelists is that the book of Job, that all of Scripture can help us face this climate crisis, that we are called outside ourselves to humility, to joy, to see wilderness, the vastness of creation, and that this is somehow comforting to Job and also to us. So we will hear first from Ted Hiebert, then from Kathryn Schifferdecker, then Ched Myers, then Bill himself will speak, will respond and give us his own biblical work here, and then I'll open it up to the floor. There will be time for discussion, but I certainly invite you to keep your questions short, like 1 minute, let's say, so that there's really time to hear from as many of you as possible. We begin with Ted Hiebert, the Dean at McCormick Seminary in Chicago.
Good afternoon. Before anything else, I want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude publicly to Bill McKibben for this book. Not just my gratitude, actually, but also the gratitude of many, many of my students. For quite a while now, I've taught a course at McCormick called Job and His Modern Interpreters, in which I've always included Bill McKibben's ecological reading of Job. Barbara Rossing and I have also used this book in our course at McCormick and LSTC on nature in the Bible. Many students in these classes over the years have been surprised by this book and have for the first time realized that the world of nature is an essential part of their faith. Or, as Bill puts it in the introduction to this book, that one can't believe deeply in God and yet be cavalier about God's creation. Each time I've taught the class on Job, I've been so moved by the ways in which this book has changed my students' views of what it means to be religious, that I've intended to take the best papers and send them to Bill to give him some idea of the power and influence. Oh, that's nice.
I asked for it.
Thank you. To give him some sense of the power and influence of the book. But I never have. So here, publicly, I want to address this sin of omission in a small way and thank you on behalf of all of my students who have been changed by your book. Bill dedicates this book to the men, women, and pastors of the Johnsburg United Methodist Church. Not only has Bill spoken to them in this book, he's influenced a whole generation of women and men preparing for ministry. And I mean really changed their minds about what it is to be people of faith. I've been struck over the years by how in a crisis, people, religious and non-religious alike, instinctively go back to their elemental religious traditions in the Bible for wisdom and reorientation. This has certainly been true in response to the environmental crisis. So Bill McKibben's work in this book to clarify biblical traditions and tell us what we might learn from them is part of a larger and very important task. I'd like to respond to Bill's work by talking about his insights into the book of Job, and also about how the Joban ideas Bill highlights are part of a larger biblical imagination from which we can draw in this time of crisis. I'd like to do so by focusing on 3 ideas. The 2 great lessons Bill learns from Job, humility and joy, and one further idea, an idea Bill alludes to at a number of places in his book. This is the Bible's serious interest in the natural world, a seriousness that might even be described as scientific in character. An idea we've basically wished to avoid in our conversations about the Bible and the environment. So let me begin with humility. The first and foremost lesson Bill believes Job learns about his role in the world, and the first and foremost thing Bill believes we need to recover to live properly in the world today. As Bill recognizes with such clarity and passion in his book, the ancient Israelite sage who wrote God's speeches in chapters 38 to 41 of Job had a profound sense of human smallness in the world. In order to make this point, this sage chose to catalog for us not the details of the domestic landscape of small-scale agriculture that typified life in ancient Israel, but the details of the world where the wild things were, where Israelites didn't live, which they didn't control, and which they hardly understood. The key point I want to make in response to Bill's accurate and passionate insight about human restraint and humility in Job is this. In decentering the human in the world, Job's author is not a voice crying in his wilderness, not a marginal voice, but in fact, part of a major trajectory of thought in the Hebrew Scriptures. Job's views, in fact, go back all the way to the Yahwist, the great epic narrator of Israel's origins in Genesis. Unfortunately, the Yahwist's profound sense of human restraint has been hidden from us by our obsession with the priest story of creation in Genesis 1, and our relative lack of interest in the Yahwist's creation story in Genesis 2. The priestly story in Genesis 1 describes humans created in God's image and gives them power to rule the animals and to subdue the earth. The Yahwist's creation story in Genesis 2 positions humans in the world completely differently. It already champions, in fact, the idea of human restraint we find in Job. In the Yahwist's account of creation, an account deeply influenced by the agricultural economy of biblical society, the first human is created not in God's image, as in Genesis 1, nor out of the dust of the ground, as in Genesis 2, as it's usually translated, as Genesis 2:7 is usually translated, but rather out of the topsoil of fertile land, as we've translated this verse in the Common English Bible. Moreover, the Yahwist's first human is charged not to rule the animals and to subdue the earth, as in the priest's creation story, but literally to serve the fertile land out of which he was formed. The Hebrew verb avad is usually translated dress or till or work or farm, but it's much stronger and sharper than that. It literally and simply and primarily means to serve one's master or one's king or one's God, or, in this case, the soil. It completely reverses the balance of power. It identifies humans not as the land's rulers, but as its servants. And it decenters humans. At the center of the Yahwist's landscape is the fertile soil, out of which all life, human, animal, plant, is formed. The needs of the fertile land, not human ingenuity, become the measure for human behavior. What the sage who wrote Job discovered in the wilderness, the Yahwist and his people discovered in the agricultural landscape on which they depended for their very lives. As Bill McKibben himself has noted in his foreword to Healing Ground, Walking the Farms of Vermont, small farmers are the champion noticers of our world. I don't want to bash the priestly writer and his powerful humans without saying that in an age where humans exercise unprecedented power, we may well need an image of the responsible exercise of power, which I believe the priestly writer holds. But I do want to shake us free from the notion that the Bible is really about dominion, and that Job might be a kind of outlier in this world. Not Bill's view, by the way, but one which, without knowing, in addition to Job, about the Yahwist and the Yahwist's distinctive view of the human, we are inclined to hold. The point I want to make is that Job's idea of human restraint that Bill highlights so enthusiastically in his book is part of a larger and essential biblical tradition, every bit as much a part of the Bible's DNA as the image of dominion which has dominated our conversations. The Yahweh's view of human restraint, shared by the author of Job, has been deeply influential among environmentalists, in spite of our culture's popular obsession with the priestly dominion of Genesis 1. To illustrate this, let me highlight the case of John Muir, the centennial of whose death we celebrate this year, and whom Bill refers to in his book. In fact, it was Bill's book that put me on the trail of John Muir as a modern-day Yahwist. Muir's language about the human place in nature is so biblical in tone that it's easy to see the effects of his dad's forcing him to memorize Scripture. When he writes in A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, quotes, "The world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all of the facts." It's quite obvious that he has Genesis 1 and its powerful humans in mind. And when he provides his own alternative to this viewpoint, his dependence on the Yahwist's language in Genesis 2, as Bill notices, is obvious. Quotes, "From the dust of the earth, from the common elementary fund, the Creator has made Homo sapiens. From the same material, he has made every other creature, however noxious and insignificant to us. They are earth-born companions and our fellow mortals." Aldo Leopold, Wendell Berry, and Wes Jackson, to name just 3 others, all draw on this same language of human restraint and humility from the Yahwist and from Job when they position the human in the world. Before moving on to the second lesson Bill learns from Job, the experience of joy in the world's bounty and beauty, let me pick up on Bill's comment that, quotes, "Small farmers are the champion noticers of our world." In order to say a few words about the Bible's serious interest in nature, when speaking about biblical writers, Bill refers to the scientific quality of their insights. He observes that in their care to protect the soil on which their livelihood depended, ancient Israelite farmers were, quotes, "ecologically sensible." And he recognizes, quotes, "the wonderfully specific biology in the priest's catalog of plants on the 3rd day of creation in Genesis 1. And he describes the precision of some of the sages' language in God's great nature speeches in Job 38:41 as biologically accurate. I want to emphasize and extend these observations to make the point that biblical authors took the world of nature seriously, so seriously that their interest in it might better be described as scientific than anything else. I'm speaking here not of modern science, nor of creation science, but of ancient science, a moment of time in the history of science. What I mean to say by this is that biblical writers like Job's author and the priestly writer and the Yahwist, in their close and systematic study of nature and their writing about it, were every bit as serious and rigorous about studying and describing the natural world as a modern scientist is. This is crucial to recognize because it may help us recover nature as religiously important. When new scientific cosmologies moved beyond ancient biblical ones, a big divide opened up between science and religion. Many religious people either fought science when it disagreed with the Bible, or they handed the natural world over to science and confined themselves to spiritual matters. This splitting off of biblical religion from nature, considered seriously and scientifically, has taken many forms. One is the Frankfurt's assertion in The Intellectual Adventure of Ancient Man that biblical writers possessed a pre-analytical, non-rational, mythic mindset, sometimes subsumed under the term mythopoeic thought. Another is the great Heilsgeschichte movement in biblical theology that disconnected God's activity in the world from nature and reconnected it exclusively with history. A third is the great philosophical divide in Western thought that drew an absolute line between matter and the spirit and valued spirit over matter. A fourth is the popular practice among liberal scholars and theologians of characterizing biblical descriptions of the natural world as just theology or poetry or myth. These approaches to the Bible and biblical faith have pushed us to the view Bill McKibben describes in the first 2 pages of his book, that one can believe in God and yet be cavalier about God's creation. I don't believe in any of these approaches to the Bible anymore. I believe that the physical world was not a peripheral concern to biblical writers, but a central concern. So central that they studied it and wrote about it with the rigor of a scientist. God's nature speeches in Job, just as the creation accounts in Genesis, reflect their author's close observation of natural facts, careful classification of details observed, and the construction of theories to explain these facts and their relationships. We don't have time here to satisfactorily defend these biblical writers as scientists, ancient scientists, that is, but we can refer, by way of illustration, to the careful detail with which Job's author describes untamed nature, descriptions Bill McKibben rightly recognizes as biologically accurate. Israel's sages, after all, were the great observers of the world and the great recorders of their observations among Israel's educated elite. Or we can mention the priestly writer's careful classification of plant and animal species in Genesis 1. Or we can notice the Yahwist's profound understanding of the centrality of topsoil as the source of life. The Yahwist knew with his ancient science what we, with all of our advances in science, seem to have forgotten. As my friend Tim Weiskell put it, there is no such thing as a post-agricultural society. In each of these cases, we find the interest, inclinations, and insights of the scientist. We find writers who took nature seriously. This is important because it means that biblical writers did their theology in the context of the best science available to them. They saw no conflict between good science and good theology. Scholars have always puzzled over how it is that Job's author tried to solve the problem of a lack of justice in human affairs with a divine speech about Job's place in nature. But this is typical of biblical thought. The sages behind the books of Proverbs and Job continually defined humanity and evaluated human behavior within the context of the natural world. And by beginning their epics with creation, the priestly writer and the Yahwist grounded their definitions of humanity in their understanding of the human place in the cosmos. If we could learn from the way biblical writers did their theology in the context of nature, we'd always be developing our theologies as Bill McKibben's has done in this book, by connecting them directly with the state of the world. Having given the author of Job, together with the priestly writer and the Yahwist, their due as scientists who did their theology in the context of nature and their study of it, let me talk about them also in closing as poets who evoke joy in nature. The second great lesson Bill recovers from the divine speeches in Job is the experience of joy in the fantastic beauty of the natural world, an emotion he believes is essential to avoid the arid negativism of humility by itself. I'm not sure joy is the first word I'd have used to characterize God's speeches out of the whirlwind. The whirlwind, after all, is one of nature's fierce phenomena, which, together with the thunderstorm, Israel associated closely with God. So there may be genuine fear on Job's part. There's certainly humility, I am of small account, and stunned silence, I lay my hand on my mouth. As for how God felt, we wish we had stage directions for God's tone of voice, don't we? I'm pretty sure there's a lot of withering sarcasm here, probably also some exasperation and annoyance, maybe even a little defensiveness, and certainly approbation. And yet, the Israelite sage who wrote God's speeches did go on, did say more about nature than he needed to in order to get his points across, didn't he? Why such an extensive tour of the cosmos? The detailed cosmological structure, the catalog of meteorological phenomena, the identification of constellations, the surprising detail of wild animal behaviors. In composing these divine speeches, it's almost as if the sage is showing off a little bit, taking this opportunity to convey all of his learning about nature in most exquisite detail, reveling in his knowledge, actually full of wonder and joy almost at the vastness of the world he can describe. To place this sage's exuberance into the larger biblical context and to show how it too is part of the Bible's DNA, we could refer to many Psalms. But let me add one example of joy in nature from the great creation story in Genesis 1, an example that has been lost in translation. 7 times, a number of completeness and perfection, the priestly writer says, God saw that it was good, making one of the great affirmations about the integrity of creation in the Bible. Translated in this way, the Hebrew phrase ki tov attributes to God a cognitive reaction, an intellectual response to creation, the recognition of a fact about it, a bit of divine knowledge. But if we look more closely at the phrase ki tov, we encounter God's own joy in creation. The word tov may mean good, which we first think of with a moral sense probably, but it more frequently means beautiful, exquisitely made, of the highest quality, of precious value. It's primarily an aesthetic term describing the exquisite quality and beauty of creation. Furthermore, long ago, W.F. Albright recognized, on the basis of comparative Semitic evidence, that the word ki is not just a subordinating conjunction meaning that, stating a simple fact, key may also, as here, express special emphasis, so that we should translate, as we have in the Common English Bible, God saw how good it was. By shifting from the conjunction that to the adverb how, we realize that the priestly writer intended to invest God's response to creation with wonderment, with emotional depth. The verb how evokes God's feelings about the world, God's surprise almost, and delight that the world was so perfectly done, so wonderfully new, so completely right. It evokes God's joy in creation. For the priestly writer, therefore, God becomes not just the ultimate model for creativity or for Sabbath keeping, but also for joy in creation. This is the same exuberance of Job's God, an enthusiastic joy that Bill McKibben has reminded us, even in the dreadful crisis in which we find ourselves, is absolutely essential for living, for healing ourselves, and for healing the world.
Okay, we're all going to want to buy the Common English Bible at Abingdon Press there. So our next speaker is Kathryn Schifferdecker, who teaches at Lutheran Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and has written a book on the book of Job. I forgot the name of it.
Out of the Whirlwind.
Out of the Whirlwind. It's a wonderful book. So, Kathryn.
That's fine. No, it isn't. That's a little disconcerting. I'll ignore it. As Ted already did, I want to begin my presentation with a sincere thank you to Bill McKibben for your faithful, persistent, even prophetic call to all of us to pay attention, to take a stand, and to work together, as the 350.org website puts it, to dismantle the influence and infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry and to develop people-centric solutions to the climate crisis. From your 1989 book, The End of Nature, the first book on climate change for the general public, to your more recent founding of the activist movement, 350.org, and your work against the Keystone XL pipeline, you have been a voice of passion and purpose, and your work against the Keystone XL pipeline, and as the recent vote in the Senate shows, you've made a difference. Sorry. There's a very long way to go, of course, but we are all in your debt. 20 years ago, you published The Comforting Whirlwind, the first work, as far as I know, to assert that the biblical book of Job actually has something to say to our current ecological crisis. Specifically, as Ted already said, you argue in that book that the two great lessons of the book of Job are a call to humility and a call to joy. Both are important because, as you say, humility by itself is an arid negativism, and joy by itself can turn into some New Age irresponsibility where we come to identify the cosmos with us and not vice versa. But humility and joy together are powerful to change hearts and minds. I think you are exactly right in your reading of Job and the Whirlwind speeches. Humility and joy are key. I want, in my time today, to talk more about those two calls in the Whirlwind speeches and then to add a third, a call to justice. By way of background, as we all know, the Whirlwind speeches in Job have engendered lots of disgruntlement and even dismay on the part of readers over the years. William Safire expresses many people's dissatisfaction with those speeches when he says, "It's as if God appears in a tie-dyed t-shirt emblazoned with the words, 'Because I'm God, that's why.'" One of my students opined that on the back of the t-shirt it should say, "And you are?" God undoubtedly puts Job in his place in the Whirlwind speeches, but as you, Bill, have shown and as others have argued, that place is not one of abject humiliation and abasement. God does not beat Job over the head with the world. God instead invites Job to live with humility and joy, humility and wonder in this beautiful, wild, and dangerous world that God has made. First, humility. What are human beings? Ma anosh in Hebrew. Job asks in chapter 7, an obvious parody of Psalm 8. The psalmist asks the question as he gazes up at the night sky, ablaze with countless stars, and he answers in wonder and astonishment that human beings are made just a little lower than God. Job answers the question in an entirely different way. In Job 7, he says, "What are human beings that you magnify them, that you pay attention to them, that you visit them every morning, that you test them every moment? Will you not turn your gaze from me? Will you not leave me alone long enough for me to swallow my spit?" That's some chutzpah. For the writer of Psalm 8, human beings are the center of creation, made to rule over every other creature in the world. For Job, human beings, especially he himself, are the center of God's unwanted attention, objects of God's excessive scrutiny. While Job's bitter answer to the question, "What are human beings?" is different from the psalmist's, they have this in common. For both figures, humanity occupies a central position in creation. For one, humanity is the crown of creation. For the other, the chief object of God's overzealous attention. The Whirlwind speeches answered Job's and the psalmist's question with a resounding silence about humanity. In the long catalog of creatures, celestial and terrestrial, that comprise the Whirlwind speeches, there is one glaring omission. There is one creature that is conspicuous only by its absence. God says to Job in chapter 38, "Who has cut a channel for the flood and a way for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain upon the uninhabited land, the wilderness where no person lives, to satisfy the desolate and waste land and to cause the parched land to sprout grass?" In the Hebrew, the point is even more explicit. Translated literally, the phrases in 38:26 are land with no human and wilderness with no man in it. The very common Hebrew words used here for human or person, ish and adam, are used nowhere else in the Whirlwind speeches. And here, in their only appearance in the speeches, they are negated. No human, no man, lo ish, lo adam. This is a radically non-anthropocentric vision of creation. Consider Psalm 8 again. What are human beings that you think of them, mortals that you pay attention to them, yet you have made them only a little lower than God, and with glory and honor you have crowned them. You have made them rule over the works of your hands. You have put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, and also the wild animals of the field, and whatever passes through the paths of the seas. In this psalm, and in the related text, the priestly account of Genesis 1, human beings are the crown of creation and have divinely ordained dominion over every other living creature on earth, including whatever passes through the paths of the seas. In what may be a deliberate contrast with the psalm, at the end of Job, God challenges Job to control any of the wild animals, including Leviathan, the most fearsome creature to pass through the sea. This is Job 41. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Can you press down his tongue with rope? Will you place a line in his nose? Will you pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he plead for favor with you or speak meekly to you? Will he make a covenant with you to be your servant forever? Can you play with him as with a bird? Will you leash him for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among merchants? Lay your hand upon him, and you will not long remember the battle. God does not describe human dominion over Leviathan, the sea dragon. Quite to the contrary, God challenges Job to use Leviathan in any of the ways that human beings use animals, for labor, for companionship, for sport, for food, and shows any such plans to be ludicrous. Lay your hand upon him, and you will not long remember the battle. Leviathan will not be a servant, a pet, or a source of food for Job or for any other human being. Leviathan is fierce and wild and utterly unapproachable, a creature who laughs derisively at paltry human weapons. In contrast to the claims of the psalmist, at least this particular creature who passes through the paths of the sea is not under human dominion. Indeed, the Whirlwind speeches end by calling Leviathan king over all who are proud. The creation theology of the Whirlwind speeches calls humanity to a place of humility in relationship to the natural world. Creation is not made for the sake of humanity. It comes into being for the pleasure of its creator. We are not in control, and we shouldn't be in control. Ellen Davis puts the issue this way: the great question that God's speech out of the whirlwind poses for Job and every other person of integrity is this: can you love what you do not control? Can you love what you do not control? The wild animals, the sea, Leviathan. Can you love them not because of what you get out of them, but because they are fellow creatures with you in this wild and beautiful creation? The vision of creation in the whirlwind speeches can fruitfully be used as a corrective to a consumerist view of the natural world, as you show in your book, Bill. To that consumerist culture, the whirlwind speeches offer a radical vision. The speeches proclaim that humanity is not the center of the universe, that there exist creatures and places that have an intrinsic value quite apart from anything to do with human beings. The whirlwind speeches assert that no creature or land can properly be called God-forsaken. Indeed, God takes delight in all that God creates, most especially those creatures and places that are unused and unusable by human beings. The Christian church in some times and places has understood this insight well. I had the privilege to spend my recent sabbatical teaching at a seminary in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I learned there about the fascinating work of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a church which dates back to the 4th century. That church is the guardian of old groves, the remnants of the original Afro-montane forests that covered the highlands of northern Ethiopia thousands of years ago, now all but destroyed by centuries of human settlement and agricultural activity. In a landscape largely devoid of trees and suffering from erosion and periodic droughts, these church forests remain as islands of biodiversity, green jewels dotting the barren landscape. And at the center of each is an Orthodox church. The priests who guard these forests speak of them as sacred places, and the forests supply their church communities with shade, medicines, fresh water, and wood for making liturgical objects. Ranging in size from 5 acres to more than 1,000 acres and separated from each other by miles of treeless fields, these forests, while they do not support the wildlife that they once did, are still alive with birdsong and insect life. They stand as remnants of what was and an earnest of what might be again. The Orthodox priests who tend these forests are practicing the virtue of humility, which at its Latin root is related to the word humus, the fertile soil. They recognize their kinship with all of God's creatures and the right of those creatures to enjoy the sweetness of life. And they act accordingly, guarding what remains of the ancient forests and keeping them for future generations. Humility is key. We must understand our place in this world if we are to live with restraint and respect. Humility is key. So are joy and wonder. Over 1,000 miles to the south of those church forests, a vast park stretches across northern Tanzania and southern Kenya. The Serengeti, composed of endless plains of grass dotted with rock outcroppings and acacia trees, is inhabited by animals varied and strange and wonderful. Elephants, lions, cheetahs, leopards, impala, Cape buffaloes, wildebeest, baboons, warthogs, zebras, ostriches, hippos, crocodiles, puff adders. It is the world of the whirlwind speeches in Job, in all of its wild and wonderful freedom, and I was privileged to spend some days there in the spring of my sabbatical year. My strongest memory of that trip will always be, I think, the night that my husband and I spent looking up at the stars, unobscured by any artificial light for 100 miles in any direction. The stars of the Serengeti night fill the black velvet sky with brilliant points of light, diamonds spilled across every inch of sky. Looking up, one stares into the center of our own galaxy, a wide band of milky white punctuated by countless stars, a part of the sky so dense with stars that there is no visible space between them, the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. What are human beings? Asks the psalmist, gazing up at that same night sky in awe. What are human beings, asks Job, so burdened with grief that he curls in upon himself and cannot see beyond his own pain? And God answers by taking Job to where the wild things are. God takes Job to where the wild things live in all their fierce freedom, far outside the bounds of human control. God displays this complex, beautiful world to Job and asks Job question after question. Are you able? Do you know? God invites Job to humility, to learn his place in God's world as a creature of the earth, a human from the humus. God invites Job to humility and then opens his eyes to look beyond his own grief and see the beauty around him. God invites Job to wonder, to delight in the world with a measure of God's own joy. Humility and joy. The vision of creation God gives to Job moves him to look beyond his pain and grief, moves him to life again, even after great pain. As you showed us 20 years ago, Bill, humility, learning our place in this world, and joy, delighting with God's delight in the beauty and wildness of creation, have the potential to move us to life again, in a world where we are too often the instruments of death and destruction. I want to move in the last few minutes I have to speak about one more call I hear in the Whirlwind speeches, the call to justice. Now, we're not used to speaking about justice in our relationship to the natural world. The key biblical term for our relationship with creation is more often stewardship. And stewardship is indeed a useful way of thinking about that relationship. It implies that we do not own what we have been given. It implies that we are caretakers of a precious gift on behalf of the true owner. It implies that we simply use what we need and conserve the gift for those who come after us. These are all good biblical insights. God tells the Israelites who are about to enter the land that no family or individual among them can accumulate too much land. Any land that has been sold because of economic hardship must be returned in the Jubilee year to the family who sold it. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity because the land is mine, says God. With me you are but sojourners and tenants. If the true owner of the land is God, then we use the land only for a time, and we are to care for that land as good stewards in order to pass it along to those who come after us. Good farmers have always known this truth. Stewardship is indeed a good and useful way of thinking about a relationship with the rest of creation, and it has deep biblical roots. It is not the only way, however, of conceptualizing that relationship. Justice is another way of speaking about humanity's relationship with the rest of the natural world, and that concept, too, has biblical roots. Listen again to God's speeches to Job from Job 38. Who lets the wild ass go free? Who loosens the bonds of the wild ass? I made the steppe its home and the salty waste its dwelling place. It scoffs at the tumult of the city. It does not hear the shouts of the taskmaster. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will it spend the night at your feeding trough? Will you bind the wild ox in a furrow with your rope? Will it plow the lowlands after you? In the first chapter of the book, we learn that Job was the owner of 500 donkeys and 1,000 oxen. At the end of the book, God introduces Job to the wild cousins of his domesticated livestock. The wild donkey ranges across the wasteland free of any restraint and released from the hard labor its domestic cousin has to perform. Indeed, the wild donkey laughs scornfully at the tumult of the city, that quintessential human habitation. Likewise, the wild ox will neither plow Job's fields nor be kept in Job's barns. These animals, unlike their domestic cousins, have nothing to do with human beings. Their existence is one of wild, unfettered freedom. How much more is this the case for the creatures God describes in the second speech? Behemoth is a primeval land creature, resembling the hippopotamus, but with bones like bronze and limbs like iron. And Leviathan, as we've already seen, that legendary sea dragon, laughs at human weapons which bounce off its impenetrable skin. Of the former, God says, "Look now at Behemoth, which I made along with you." And of the latter, he surveys all who are raised up. He is king over all who are proud. These animals, wild and free, have nothing to do with human beings. They will not serve humanity. They will not consent to being humanity's pets or servants. Behemoth is made with Job, or just in the way that Job was made. Job and Behemoth have the same creator. Even more radically, Leviathan, not Job, is king over all who are proud, a creature not to be trifled with. The wild creatures of the first God speech and the two mythological creatures of the second speech inhabit a world quite outside human civilization and completely beyond the sphere of human influence. To speak of Job's relationship to these wild creatures in terms of stewardship simply misses the point. How can he be a steward of something over which he has no control? How can he take care of creatures who neither need nor desire such care, creatures who scorn humanity and its inventions? The operative word for talking about humanity's relationship to the wild creatures described in the Whirlwind speeches is justice. The speeches describe a world in which humanity does not occupy the central position, a world that is radically non-anthropocentric. Humanity has a place in that world, to be sure. Job, after all, is the only passenger on this grand whirlwind tour of the cosmos. That place, however, is not what Job or we thought it was. The world does not revolve around us. We are not the center of the universe. The world instead is made for the delight of its creator, and it is full of wild, strange, and fierce creatures, creatures who are dangerous to us, creatures who live their whole lives oblivious to us and our daily concerns. If humanity then is only one part of a vast and varied whole, justice demands that we live in such a way that the other creatures God has created with us are allowed to be and become who God created them to be. Justice demands that the wild creatures of the earth be allowed to flourish free of human exploitation. Justice demands that we share the earth's resources, not only with our human brothers and sisters, but also with the other creatures who inhabit the earth with us. Some in the history of the church have understood this insight, most notably, of course, St. Francis of Assisi. Basil the Great also understood this truth. Writing in the 4th century, he prays for a right understanding of humanity's relationship with the rest of God's creatures. Basil says, "O God, enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers, the animals, to whom thou gavest the earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of humankind with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to you in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for you, and that they love the sweetness of life." Basil is talking about kinship with his fellow creatures and about justice. These two concepts, stewardship and justice, are not mutually exclusive, of course, nor are the biblical passages that speak of them. Both Adam in the garden and Job in the whirlwind speeches are given privileged positions from which to observe and participate in God's beautiful creation. As Ted described so eloquently, Adam is given responsibility to serve, avad, and to keep, shamar, the garden. Job is taught humility and joy in relationship to the natural world. In our current environmental crisis, both of these biblical voices should be heeded. According to Genesis 2, humanity is given responsibility to be stewards of the earth, serving it and keeping it. We must exercise that responsibility with care. According to the whirlwind speeches, humanity is not the center of creation and should therefore live with humility on this earth. We must tread lightly. In this current age, when we as a species have become more powerful than the author of Job could ever have imagined, we need to understand ourselves as stewards, of course, and we need to take that responsibility seriously. But we also need to understand and heed the biblical call to humility, to joy, and to justice in our relationship with the rest of creation. Our lives, the lives of those we love, and the lives of all the creatures of this precious planet depend upon it. One final quick word. We, as professional scholars of Bible and religion, bear a particular responsibility to articulate the biblical vision of stewardship and justice, of humility and joy, a vision that Bill so eloquently set forth in his book. The crisis of climate change will not be solved by technology or by politics or even by an appeal to informed self-interest. The crisis will only be solved by conversion of minds and hearts. And as Bill noted in his book, the church, the synagogue, and other faith communities are in a unique position to work for such conversion. We are, at our best, able to speak to the deepest yearning of human beings for community and meaning. We are able to call people to find real joy, not in possessions, but in relationship with God, with one another, and with God's wild, fierce, and beautiful creation. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, says Job to God at the end of the Whirlwind speeches, but now my own eyes have seen you. May the same be true for us as we answer the biblical call to humility, to joy, to stewardship, and to justice.
The call to justice is a perfect segue into our third speaker, Ched Myers, who's a prolific author, scholar, practitioner of justice, who works not too far from here, north of Los Angeles, and has introduced the idea of watershed discipleship, which I think he will bring into his paper. Anyway, Ched Myers is a wonderful activist and scholar, and we look forward to his response.
Well, Bill, can you take all this love? Here's a little bit more. Whether we know it or not, friends, every one of us in this room owe a huge debt of gratitude to this brother, whose life's work of truth-telling, movement-building, and relentless advocacy has animated a truly grassroots movement, an initiative now that effectively translates the complexities of climate change into mobilizing sound bites, thinking particularly, of course, of 350.org. Bill, you've worked doggedly and faithfully from your start in the 1980s as a canary in the coal mine to having become now, in the spirit of my comments and to paraphrase Proverbs 30:17, a wise raven poking out the eyes of a defiant fossil fuel industry. Honestly, friend, I don't know the toll that the last 30 years has taken on you, your body and your spirit. I know it's hard work. But here you are, still standing, a gift to the church and the world. And the invitation to speak here at AARSBL is just one of the many indications of how deeply and widely your summons to carbon repentance has penetrated into the culture. So be encouraged and know that you are greatly loved and esteemed by those of us who would accompany you on this journey. Thank you. And thanks also to Peter and Barbara and others who have organized this little chance. You know, it's very impressive to all of us Bible geeks here that you, a science-y journalist committed to making intelligible the ominous ultimatum of climate catastrophe, were both inclined and able to write a compelling reflection on a biblical book. And that relatively early in your career. I still can't work out whether it was your third or fourth book, but it was pretty early on. Now, the Whirlwind Project, of course, testifies to your own robust Methodist faith, and you are something of a John Wesley for our times. But this book also indicates how deeply you've been trying to think through the roots of our civilizational crisis. You're drawing here on old wisdom in hopes of inspiring the radical culture change required by the historical cul-de-sac into which our carbon addictions have led us. I want to acknowledge, and I think we all should, that Bill McKibben was well ahead of the theological curve in terms of reading Scripture with ecological eyes. Today, Job 38-41 has become a go-to text for creation hermeneutics and spirituality. But the journalist formerly known with the New Yorker was a pioneer of this. So that's why we all use your book in our work and appreciate it so very much. In the preface to The Comforting Whirlwind, you wrote, "The stories from the Bible, from Job, are deeply radical. They fit not comfortably with our present way of seeing things. Parts of these stories will be equally unpalatable to the left and to the right, and simply maddening to the middle." End quote. No kidding. Indeed, your work on Job stands in the noble hermeneutic tradition of engaged readers of Word and World, such as Jacques Ellul, Martin Luther King Jr., William Stringfellow, Dorothy Sölle, Ernesto Cardenal, Cornel West, Elizabeth McAllister, none of whom, let it be noted, were professional biblical scholars. You, thus in this book, have the freedom to make compelling hermeneutical analogies. So, for example, the tiresome rehashing of conventional ancient notions of justice and theodicy between Job and his interrogator accusers, you compare to the relentless propaganda of modern economic legitimations of ever more desperate resource extraction and absolutist ideologies of growth, the conventional wisdom that is killing us. And you compare the great contradicting fact of Job's innocence to the inconvenient truths of our interlocking ecological crises today, which you have revealed that the mighty locomotive of progress is Casey Jonesing us toward a cliff of no return. The core argument of your book is that the pious orthodoxies of Job's interrogators and of the apostolic managers of global capitalism are each ultimately rooted in anthropocentric presumption. In Job's case, as you put it, his friends believed that God's calculus was their own. In our case, our technological Prometheanism has usurped history altogether, spawning what I think Barbara already mentioned as this dark new epic called the Age of the Anthropocene. Which brings you to the great counterpoint of Job's narrative, the deeply sarcastic divine voice, as you call it, that takes over the story in chapter 38. The remarkable discourse from the Whirlwind means to sweep away every anthropocentric fantasy, especially those that are theologically legitimated. And you presciently identified this ancient text as a profound correction to which we moderns must attend. Now, my job is to extend this trajectory into the New Testament, and in fact, the very argument that emanates from Job's epiphany was later reiterated by Jesus of Nazareth, and I might add, somewhat more concisely. And Peter Giordi, thank you. In Luke's gospel, Jesus, in the middle of a strongly worded diatribe about the economic delusions and entitlements of the rich, suddenly whirls around and exhorts his disciples to pay attention to birds and wildflowers. Luke 12, 24-28. This text also cuts diametrically across our most sacred North American assumptions regarding economic security. In our world of jittery global financial markets, tenuous healthcare, and fraying social safety nets, Jesus' command, "Don't be anxious," seems frankly absurd. We shrug this text off as a quaint St. Francis moment. Jesus may be talking to the birds, but he's sure as hell not talking to us. But Jesus is simply summarizing the argument from Job's Whirlwind, and he's dead serious. Luke 12, thus, is for us truly a text of terror, demanding that we confront the three great pathological characteristics of modern culture: addiction, anxiety, and alienation. Luke 12, 24-28 lies at the heart of a narrative sequence that features an extended teaching about economics, and you've got a little outline floating around there. The section begins with a dispute over a family estate in verse 13, but in antiquity as today, inheritance laws function largely to facilitate the consolidation of elite wealth across the generations, as revealed by the work of United for a Fair Economy over the last decade regarding the estate tax code in the U.S. Jesus uses this opportunity to address the deeper issue, launching into an extended meditation about the fundamental struggle between the dominant imperial economy of extraction and scarcity and the divine economy of commonwealth and grace. His teaching commences with the strongest possible double warning: watch out, guard yourselves against, he cautions, every form of greed. Now, pleonexia is the condition of having too much or growing too big. Like other sages in antiquity, Jesus understood pleonexia as not as a moral category, but as a lethal predatory force. He then unpacks this diagnosis through two contrasting object lessons. The negative example of a rich farmer who can't imagine having too much, and the corrective lesson taught by the birds and flowers. Both examples conclude with parallel proverbs about what constitutes true treasure, as you can see from the outline. The story of the rich farmer, the first of three sobering Lucan parables about rich men, is an archetypal illustration of pleonexia. The land provides abundance as a gift, as 12:16 carefully stipulates, but the farmer, we might call him Monsieur Monsanto, appropriates it all as a private entitlement. His internal monologue, which I've included in the handout because it's so remarkable, is full of first-person pronouns, no less than 11 times underlined in the handouts. Me, my, I. And he has a limitless appetite. In other words, he inhabits a radically solipsistic world of privilege. Bill McKibben might editorialize that this is not unlike the rich nations of the Anthropocene, determined to amass wealth regardless of ecological or social costs. In any case, the parable's punchline is sharp and unequivocal. The divine voice unmasks this agricultural baron as a fool, a deft midrash on two Hebrew Bible indictments of the wealthy oppressor class, one found in Psalm 14, the other in Jeremiah 17. The smart money, counters Jesus, should rather side with God's commonwealth, which stands in rhetorical contrast. Don't be anxious, instead pay attention to creation. I believe we can see here a faint echo, albeit abbreviated, of the rhetorical strategy of Job. First, make it clear that the conventional wisdom is bankrupt. Second, contrast it with an object lesson from nature. That's the argument of Job. Consider the raven, says the usual translation, hardly capturing the force of the verb katanoesate, an aorist imperative that commands action here and now. This is not a suggestion to take a break and smell the flowers. It is an urgent survival strategy. Invoking the raven, Korax, only here in the New Testament, is another echo of the whirlwind. Job 38:41, who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food. This same trope is reiterated in Psalm 147. I have an artist friend who practices what he calls ornithology. Ornithology. He does pay attention to ravens. They are in part of the corvid family. They're wicked smart, he says. One of 4 species, bees, ants, and humans being the others, known to be able to communicate displacement. Ravens steal food, sometimes practice deception. They seem to know the difference between now and not yet. In other words, says my friend, these birds can imagine. This sheds interesting light on the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 17. The wilderness prophet famously invokes drought in his struggle against the oppressive regime of Ahab, a page out of Moses' playbook in his battle with Pharaoh, nature versus empire. In the Elijah cycle, there's also an undercurrent of ideological contestation over who empowers fertility for Israel's dryland farming culture, the Baalist cult endorsed by Ahab's house or Creator Yahweh. Now, drought in the biblical view was the result of human apostasy, Deuteronomy 28, Haggai 1, and thus a legitimate weapon against oppressive rulers, Jeremiah 50 and 51. This ancient worldview has much to say, I might note, to our current struggle here in the state of California with deep drought and water justice. But more broadly, as Michael Northcott's brilliant political theology of climate change argues, global warming is a reminding that, to modern people, that the weather is always political. Since in antiquity famine inevitably followed drought, Elijah is dispatched by the divine voice to take refuge in a streambed, a wadi, where Creator has commanded the ravens to feed him, 1 Kings 17:4. Did the prophet apprentice to the bird in order to learn how to survive in marginal spaces, much as John the Baptist later would as part of his resistance to another empire? Well, the wadi eventually dries up, threatening to hoist Elijah on his own petard. But the next episode narrates a feeding miracle on behalf of famine victims among the Phoenician enemy. This suggests that Elijah learned some deep mysteries about the divine economy from that raven. And according to the Gospels, Jesus himself apprenticed with the Baptist in the wilderness tradition of Elijah. So it should not be surprising that the Nazarene reasserts the old lesson. The raven don't know nothing about the rich man's barns, and yet gets fed by Creator, and in turn feeds the prophet. To pay attention to the raven, then, is to be tutored in the subsistence and sustainable economy of creation. Jesus' second positive object lesson is offered by the lilies, which do not engage in hard labor, such as spinning cloth. Think women's work in third world sweatshops. But I tell you, says Jesus with rhetorical insistence, Solomon in all his glory was never wrapped around like one of these. This image refers to the sumptuous royal garb of Israel's greatest king, but probably is a euphemism for the great Solomonic temple, the zenith of Israel's civilizational aspirations. Jesus is asserting that the greatest technological and social achievement known to his Judean contemporaries had less intrinsic value than one wildflower in the divine economy. Is he here adopting the sarcastic tone of Job's whirlwind retort? More disturbing still, what if he means it? This claim, of course, could not be more contrary to our modern capitalist cosmology, which authorizes a continuing holocaust of extinction and endangerment to human and non-human creatures. Pay attention to the California condor, demands Jesus, or to any of the other 32 species of birds currently listed as either threatened or endangered in this state alone. Blather, retort our severe economic overlords dismissively. But it's not blather. Jesus is invoking a cosmology shared by indigenous and traditional peoples the world over and throughout history, which was translated into economic lifeways characterized by symbiosis with nature, sustainable local production and consumption, and cooperative and equitable work patterns, as has been shown by anthropologists such as Marshall Solins and Paul Shepard. Jesus is directing our attention rather forcefully to what Wendell Berry calls the great economy, which preceded us and will survive us. The farmer's strategy of private accumulation has been unmasked as a desperate but ultimately short-term hedge against the inevitable economic redistribution that comes with mortality. Conversely, the divine commonwealth is the only thing that endures, and thus the only treasure of actual value. The history of progress has, of course, been founded on the twin presumptions that nature is an object to exploit for our industrial purposes, and that it has value only by what we impute through our re-engineering of the biosphere for profit. But this project has placed both ecological and social systems on the brink of collapse. So who is the fool here? Do we trust an economic cosmology that sustained human life for 100,000 years or more, or one that may not last another 100? So Job and Jesus recenter us on the oldest wisdom on the planet by decentering us. But what will this mean for our historic struggle against anthropogenic ecocide? So I want to close with a thought about how we might reconstruct a theo-geocentric politics and theology in the Anthropocene, and so this doesn't entirely degenerate into a love fest. Push you just a little bit, Brother McKibben. Wendell Berry, one of those small farmer champion noticers, admittedly predates all of us in recognizing the issues at stake in our civilizational crisis. He warned us back in 1989 about what he called the futility of global thinking. He wrote, "The question that must be addressed is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for each of the planet's millions of human and natural neighborhoods, each of which is in some precious way different from all the others." Now, I think there's a certain danger of abstraction in the way we engage the global ecological crisis, especially in a culture like ours where our relationship with creation is so profoundly alienated and atrophied, and in which we are so easily overwhelmed by complexity and complicity. To critique and combat the pathologies of the Anthropocene constructively and practically requires approaches that are robustly incarnational and contextual. In particular, we need to address what Barry calls the lack of affection that arises from our epidemic placelessness, an issue that has increasingly been the subject of social and even theological reflection. As Talmudic scholar John Levinson put it, geography is simply the visible form of theology. Only a grounded faith can do battle with the placeless docetism of modernity. Only relationship with proximate biotic communities can heal our alienated superiority complex. And only the long-term project of living sustainably in a place can wean us off our addictive, compulsive consumption and quest for autonomous infinitude. In order to stand against this storm, we must stand somewhere. This means we have to also, I believe, examine the anthropocentricity of our social and political paradigms, even progressive ones. 20 years ago, as Bill was coming out with his Whirlwind book, I published an attempt at a North American theology of liberation entitled "Who Will Roll Away the Stone? Discipleship Queries for First World Christians." I concluded that project with a call to embrace the old/new socio-ecological paradigm of bioregionalism. A bioregional approach, says Kirkpatrick Sale, apprehends a place defined by its life forms, its topography, and its biota, rather than by human dictates, a region governed by nature, not legislature. And if the concept initially strikes us as strange, that may perhaps only be a measure of how distant we have become from the wisdom it conveys, end quote. I think that bioregionalism represents a radically alternative approach to social, political, economic, and cultural practice. More recently, many bioregionalists, myself included, have emphasized an even more specific locus for re-inhabitory literacy and engagement, the watershed, classically defined by John Wesley Powell as that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of the community. All life is watershed located, as permaculturist Brock Dolman puts it in his Basins of Relations. Our watersheds are our lifeboats. They underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation of all of our future aspirations and survival. Unfortunately, bioregional thought and practice have largely been ignored by Christian theology and ethics. Last year at AARSBL's section, I argued that what I call watershed discipleship might be the most useful scale for eco-theology and the church's political, economic, and sociocultural engagement in wider transition initiatives. To this end, an alliance of faith-rooted organizers and educators around North America are currently exploring the theological, ecclesial, and practical dimensions of this paradigm, including some colleagues here this morning, Sam Thomas, Sylvia Kiesmat, Laura Roberts. Watershed discipleship is an intentional triple entendre. It recognizes first that we are in a watershed historical moment, which demands that environmental and social justice and sustainability be integral to everything people of faith do and as citizens, inhabitants of specific places. Secondly, it acknowledges the inescapably bioregional locus of an incarnational following of Jesus. Our discipleship in the life of the local church necessarily takes place in a watershed. Why are we so ignorant thereof? And thirdly, it implies that we need to be disciples of our watersheds. The challenge here, to paraphrase an argument made in 1968 by Senegalese environmentalist Baba Dioum, is that we won't save places we don't love, we can't love places we don't know, and we don't know places we haven't learned. Or was that the voice from the whirlwind who said that? So the question I want to leave with you, Bill, among the others, is how can a replaced politics ground our historic struggle? One example drawn from the ongoing struggle against pipelines in Canada might suffice to make the point. Over the past several years, the Unist-Oten clan of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in British Columbia have been building an impressive capacity for long-term resistance to prevent no less than 3 proposed oil and gas pipelines from crossing their traditional land. It's clear that they're in it for the long haul, and they've counted the cost. This resonates a little bit with Kathryn's example that she cited from Ethiopia. I think we're going to see in the coming years, immediately now, that it is those who are rooted on particular land who will be most able to say no to the carbon juggernaut and to say yes to more sustainable lifeways of humility and delight. So to me, Bill, this suggests that our movement ought to be spending at least as much effort nurturing place-based politics as we do petitioning around policy issues or organizing big marches, as important as the latter are. I'm suggesting that a watershed locus is a key form of paying attention to the raven and the lily. The approach of watershed discipleship is in the tradition of Job and Jesus, theo and geocentric, and firmly straddles the dialectic of saving the earth while also delighting in it. It's my strong conviction that it can animate communities of faith to engage in contextual and constructive witness as we awaken to the realities of climate catastrophe, for which awakening we are all so deeply indebted to Bill McKibben. And I dare hope that this radical yet practical watershed approach to transition faith, if embraced fully by Christians, might even inspire the next great revival of churches as demonstration projects of sustainability in their place, determined to live in light of, not in spite of, the looming ecological endgame. Thank you.
Do people need to stand up and stretch, or can we keep going? You want to stand up? Okay, how about like 10 seconds of stand up and stretch? Uh-oh, okay. And I'll also pass around one copy of his book. We're really encouraging people to go to the Roman and Littlefield book and buy it, and we have flyers. So I'm going to start this around. Okay, I am so happy that Bill McKibben is going to speak to us this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, look, this is, I cannot tell you what a pleasure this is for me. I was very reluctant to write this book when the people at Eerdmans and at United Theological Seminary asked me to, because I'm the furthest thing from a theologian and felt extremely in over my head. And so it's a great pleasure to know that it's been a small help over the years. It certainly has to me, and I should begin by saying that the reason that I was able to write it in the first place, the reason I read it in the first place, owed a lot to Stephen Mitchell, whose translation for me was extremely important, and it may explain a little bit of that emphasis on joy that comes through. His incredibly vivid account is, well, it's very, very powerful. So I'm really grateful to Lori, to Barbara, to everybody who's put together this very, for me, very rich panel that lets me learn an enormous amount. I'm just going to offer a very few reflections and then shut up. The first is that that when we talk about the environmental crisis we're now in, and I'll talk more about this tonight, there's an utterly inescapable theological component to it, even for people who don't generally think in theological terms, simply because the size of the problem that we face, the quantity of the problem that we face makes it qualitatively different from problems that we have faced in the past. Scale becomes so important. If there were kind of environmental problems of the past didn't raise these issues in quite the same way, it's because I think they had their limits, but there are no limits now. And this goes very much to the question I think that Professor Hiebert was engaging about the kind of alternate worldviews of the priestly writer and the Yahwist, you know. It's very beautiful to read in Genesis 2 that much more, that very confident and beautiful account of how we began. And of course, then to read with mild trepidation a little bit later where it first began to go a little bit wrong. And this idea that's, I think, implicit in those early primordial chapters of Genesis, that we should probably be careful about getting too big. I'm very indebted to Professor Hiebert's rereading of the Babel story in Genesis 11. It's his vision of it as a story, a kind of etiology story about a kind of diversity and multiculturalism is very beautiful and powerful, and I find it very useful when we're in talking about those questions on campuses as we now do. But it's also true that there's another sense, at least, that story was read throughout several thousand years of history as a kind of caution against overreaching, against becoming literally too big. And that's what we've now become. There's no question that in the wake of the 20th century, the correct account for the moment is the account from Genesis 1, because we now do have dominion over the planet. We clearly began to have it when we figured out how to explode atom bombs around things. And it was Oppenheimer gazing out at Alamogordo, who quoted from the Gita and said, "We are become as gods, destroyers of worlds." And that was a kind of early iteration of this, and we've assumed this power in other ways, or are beginning to, for instance, and I think this is hinted at in those descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan, in our newfound ability to tinker with very small things, with genes, in order to create new forms of life. We become very large. But the best example of this is what we're doing to change in the most fundamental way the operation of the world around us. And I think that Barbara said it exactly right at the beginning. I mean, the most important thing that happened in the lifetime of everybody in this room was that we left behind the Holocene and entered into some other period. And just think about that for a minute. Try to really take it in. Every human being that we know about, every human being whose history we read or try to understand, grew up in the Holocene. The last 10,000 years, this period of benign climatic stability that coincided, but not coincidentally, with those rise of human civilizations. That's what we know about, and we're not there anymore. We're in a metaphorical spaceship on a path to a different planet, and a planet that everything we can tell about, guess about, will be a far, far less happy place than the one that we enjoy, the one described in those amazing speeches from the Whirlwind. One of the things that will happen as we make that transition is that we will probably, unless we get our act together very, very quickly, lose roughly half of the plants and animals that we were born in concert with on this planet. We're in the cresting part of what scientists describe as the sixth great extinction, largely because we're pushing the temperature out of the bounds. But that's not the only thing. I mean, things that were hypothetical when I was writing about them 20 years ago are now very, very much the stuff of everyday reporting. The Arctic, the summer Arctic, is now blue, not white. We've lost about 80% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. Now, routinely, each summer, humans are able to sail through the Northwest and Northeast passages, which nobody had ever gone through, even 20 years ago when I was writing this. We learned this spring, in May, that the great ice sheet of the West Antarctic has now reached a stage of what their scientists are calling irreversible melt. We had thought that those ice sheets were stable in millennial time anyway, but they turn out not to be. 20 years ago, it had not even occurred to anyone to measure the pH of the oceans because we assumed that the oceans were so large that it was impossible to fundamentally alter their chemistry, but we were very wrong. Once people began making those measurements, it became clear that the oceans are about 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. So think about the large physical features of our planet, the ones you can see from space. We're an ocean planet, and we've changed the chemistry of the water. We're a planet marked by these great agglomerations of ice at each end. Those are now disappearing. On and on and on and on. And with it, a loss of a great deal of that beauty that's described so eloquently there at the end of Job. I remember early on in the effort to kind of help build a religious environmental movement, which has been one small part of my work, though others have done far more over the years. But I remember when my friend Steve Shaw, Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, asked me to go hiking with a group of rabbis from the city, many of them Hasidic rabbis, and we went out for a couple of days on the Appalachian Trail in Connecticut, and these were not people who had ever really hiked before. They were extraordinarily urban, but it was a very beautiful couple of days. And great fun too, whenever anything would happen. I mean, when we were sitting eating lunch one day and a big branch, just for no good reason, just broke off with a mighty crack and fell down a little ways away. And instantly around there were many rabbis delivering many different brachas, many different blessings for what was going on, you know. It was remarkable. What was even more remarkable was to get to the top of the mountain. It's a small mountain, but a beautiful view out over, and one after another, these gentlemen say, I remember them saying, now I know what Moses saw, you know, now I know what it looked like, and just being overcome with that awe. Well, that's the beauty that we're losing. The trade-off for our bigness has been that loss. And of course, the beauty is the least of it. We're losing too the easy functioning of this planet that we were gifted. And the cost of that in terms of human and other life will be extraordinary. We've already seen, again, something that we couldn't have said 20 years ago except in prediction, we've already seen the effect of what happens when the weather begins to shift. Drought and flood are both now far more common than they were. The floods are terrible and horrible when they happen. We watched, say, in 2010 in Pakistan, the greatest flood since Noah. The Indus swelled to the point where it covered 25% of the country, 20 million people out of their homes, with rainfall of the kind that you can only have now in a world where warm air holds more water vapor than cold. But bad as the floods are, probably the drought is even more insidious, even worse. All that moisture being evaporated in a hotter planet. The agronomists tell us that largely because of drought, each degree increase in global average temperature from this point, this was a big study from Stanford and the University of Washington a couple years ago, each degree increase in temperature from here on in should cut grain yields about 10%. Well, we're clearly on a path right now, a trajectory to raise the temperature 4 or 5 degrees Celsius in the course of this century. If that happens, if the number of calories on Earth therefore goes down 40 or 50% or whatever it is, the cost in terms of all the things that we care about around the world are enormous. And I was grateful to Kathryn and to Ched for bringing the word justice sharply into this discussion. One of the things that's important to realize about climate change is that it's, of all the things we've figured out how to do around the world to make life difficult for other people, colonialism and imperialism, and this is probably the most devastating. To remove from people the ability to make their living from the land around them is an astonishing thing to steal. And that's precisely what we're doing. As we become large in those parts of the world where we consume lots of fossil fuel, the weight of our largeness bears down with such power on everyone around us. 2 years ago, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration published a study that showed that because of increases in heat and humidity, people can already around the world do about 10% less labor outdoors than they could before. It's become too hot and too humid at the margins, and that by the middle of the century, that figure would be 30% or more. Think about the reordering of human life that represents. And so, I think that the takeaway from all this is that our immediate dramatic task, and it's a kind of emergency task, is to figure out how to get smaller fast, how to take up less space than we are doing at the moment, how to leave more margin for the rest of humanity and for the rest of creation. And the good news about that task, again, something we couldn't have foreseen 20 years ago, is that it's possible to see how it could happen in profound ways. We did not know then just how quickly the engineers would provide us with some of the very beautiful technology that might help us do what we need to do. The price of solar panels has dropped 98% over the last 40 years. That's really important because solar panels could represent a very different, very decentralized, very spread out way, instead of the centralized largeness that we identify with modernity, a spread out, diffuse, and much smaller, but still quite dignified way of life that would come, and especially one that's most applicable to the poorest people on Earth at the moment, the people on this planet who have access to far too little energy, and I just came back from India, which is at the cusp of a historic decision between whether they're going to plunge ahead and double their coal consumption in the next 5 years, or whether they're going to double down on renewable technology and take advantage of the astonishing surplus of sunlight that they have across the subcontinent. And it's a decision that will largely be influenced by our ability to spread some money and some technology in that direction to make it much easier for them to do it. So on this question of getting smaller, which inevitably heads us in the direction of action, the question is what kind and how? I think 20 years ago I was more taken with the notion that this action would be largely individual in its, that things we needed to do were to consume less ourselves. And we do, but largely because we've waited so long to get started, those kind of changes no longer offer a sort of mathematical route out of the problem that we're in. At this point, I mean, one of the problems with having written the first book about climate change 25 years ago is that there are occasions when I have to stop myself from saying, oh, if only you had listened to me then. Because then there were many more trajectories and pathways out of this trouble, but those no longer exist. That's what happens when you keep Casey Jonesing it down this particular road. And so now we're faced with making very big changes as societies. They're not impossible ones, but they're difficult. We need to do things very quickly, like put a price on carbon that reflects the damage it does in the atmosphere. We need to do things like push very, very hard for that rapid build out of renewable energy here and everywhere around the world. And in order to do any of those things, and this I think is the hard, crucial part, we need to stand up to the powers and principalities of the world in which we live, above all the fossil fuel industry, who are, at this point, we now know, a crazy rogue force. You can see it in the largest sense. I wrote a long piece a couple of years ago for Rolling Stone that became the most widely read piece, I think, that widely shared that they'd ever had. And it wasn't because it was such a good piece, it wasn't. It was because it had a new set of numbers in it from financial analysts who had done the work of looking up all the SEC filings and that sort of thing around the world of the fossil fuel companies. And what they found was that these companies had in their reserves of coal and oil and gas 5 times as much carbon as the scientists say we can burn and still stay below the catastrophic red line of 2-degree increase in temperature. 5 times as much, but their business plan is to dig it up and burn it. In fact, they spend one company, Exxon, spends $100 million every day looking for more hydrocarbons, even though we already have 5 times as much as we can burn. This is crazy behavior. And yet it is the conventional wisdom still of the world in which we live, that this is what we will keep doing. It's the conventional wisdom even of, people like President Obama, who talk constantly about an all-of-the-above energy strategy and who have, in the course of the last 5 years, helped transform America into the largest single oil producer on earth. We just passed Saudi Arabia and Russia. That kind of stuff, that kind of behavior really is crazy. What happened when the Arctic melted? Did the fossil fuel industry say, this is a good sign that perhaps we should be becoming energy companies? And no. Put up solar panels? No. What happened was that Shell led everybody in applying for new permits to go drill for more oil in the Arctic now that it had melted. What happens when California is caught in the midst of the worst drought that anyone's ever recorded? This will be by far the warmest year in California history, about a degree above the old record. And as you know, bone dry. There are stories in today's papers about how water rustling has become a serious issue across California, with people stealing tanker trucks full of water and municipalities beginning to have to put padlocks on fire hydrants, even though this slows down by a minute or so their ability to respond to fires, simply because people, desperate people or greedy people, are stealing water. What's been the response of the fossil fuel industry to that? Not we should become energy companies and start building wind towers in California. No, they're busy on the biggest fracking boom that California's ever seen. And you know what it takes to go frack an oil well in a place like California? It takes water. It takes 300,000 or 400,000 gallons of it for each fracking event. They are literally pouring water down holes in the middle of the worst drought that there ever was. I was just talking recently with my friends at the Committee on Race, Poverty, and Environment in California, do a lot of work in the Central Valley, and they were describing communities where have run out of water, their wells have run dry, and there are tanker trucks going out to try and give them some access to water. They can come and get a little bit from their bucket in the center of town. And on the very same roads at the very same time, parades of tanker trucks full of water going to fracking wells in order to produce yet more oil that will exacerbate this cycle and make it worse. So, why do I say all these things? It's because talking about this stuff without doing something about it is ruinous to one's soul. It's necessary to stand up to these guys, to do it now, to do it quickly, and all of you can. One of the things that's happened, you know, as we've spread a kind of resistance about this in recent years, and I mean, you can tell far more than, I was reluctant to go write about Job because I'm not a theologian. I was really reluctant to go start forming organizations because I'm an introvert, you know, I'm not an activist. It's good to be with you all, but I'd really rather be home typing, you know, that's what I like to do. But as we've formed these organizations and done this work, we've had to move very quickly into resistance. And some of that resistance has been to these kind of projects. For instance, the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline's important. We're probably going to lose it in the next 6 months with the new Senate. But it's done its part already. It's spawned a kind of endless series of fights against one of the leaders of that industry in an interview in Pipeline News last year said, we'll never be allowed to build a pipeline in peace again. And he's right, nor a coal port, nor a fracking facility, nor anything else. The fight is on everywhere around the world, and it's really beginning to tell. It's driving up the cost of doing business. It's accelerating the transition. But that's all playing defense. We're also trying to play offense as best we can. There's someone in the back of the room who exemplifies both these fights, Jim Antal, the conference minister of the UCC in Massachusetts. Jim was 3 or 4 cells down from me in DC when we did the first big protests against the Keystone Pipeline, which was the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in a very long time. So he played good defense, but then he was one of the key fighters in the beginning of this transition into playing offense, which is what this divestment campaign around fossil fuel has become. And he got first the Massachusetts conference of the UCC and then the whole denomination to embrace this idea of selling off fossil fuel stock. Pretty much everybody in this room is a member of a denomination or works at a university or both. Okay, and these are 2 of the great locuses for this fight, and we need you engaged in it. It is not okay to be investing in companies that are doing the work of decreation day after day after day, companies that are running Genesis in reverse, okay? It's not okay, and when we stand up to them, we strike a blow to removing their social license. We strike a blow against the conventional wisdom of the day that these guys are proper parts of the world around us. And in the story of Job, by the way, that kind of standing up to conventional wisdom is one of the most interesting parts of that story. The book of Job seems to me interesting on many accounts. One of them is that it has this endless prologue before we get to the speeches from the Whirlwind. There's really, one of the great advantages of the Mitchell translation is that it cuts a lot of that down. But there's 30-some chapters of just basically repeating the same thing over and over and over again, like the longest setup to a joke, And the thing that they're repeating over and over again is this conventional wisdom. Oh, you must have sinned, Job, something, going on and on. And then when you finally get the punchline, it has nothing to do with any of this. It turns out there are, we've got to take on the conventional wisdom of our time. We can do that intellectually. We can talk about it all we want, and that's important. Talking and writing and teaching is important, but it also has concrete, practical aspect right now in that fight for divestment, among other things, which we need you guys taking on and leading at the institutions where you are, okay? Putting into action these ideas, standing up for justice in that kind of way. And I think that the point that Chad made at the end was so important and beautiful about what the proper locus for this fight is. Is it local, bioregional, or is it global? And I wish to heck that it was that, I live in Vermont, okay, which is a nice place and a place that's done more to kind of imagine itself as a local place than just about anywhere around. It's kind of one of the places where the local food movement was birthed. And it's been a great pleasure to be part of that. Years ago, before, the locavore movement and things, I wrote a little chapter of a book about feeding my family for a year just on things grown in our valley. It's wonderful. And left to my own devices, I would like very much to just stay in the watershed of the Middlebury River and Otter Creek and down into Lake Champlain. That's where I love to be, okay? The problem is, and that's where we should spend a great deal of our effort, making our own being in place in our local places. The problem is what happened in our watershed in 2011 when Hurricane Irene came up the east coast of the United States, and it passed over record warm water off the coast of New York and New Jersey, and so it soaked up an ungodly amount of rain, and it took that water inland and dumped it on Vermont, and we had far more rain than we've ever had in all our history. We've got good, intact forest. Vermont's 80% forest now, as opposed to 20% at the time of the Civil War. If any place in the country should have been able to hold that water as it fell, but we couldn't. There was too much of it. It's a rainstorm happening on this new planet, okay? And so it washed away roads and bridges that had been there for 200 years, It was the greatest catastrophe we've ever had. It killed a lot of people. More to the point, it took an awful lot of those beautiful, organic, local farms that people had spent years and years constructing, and in the course of an hour, washed them away. The topsoil was replaced on the river bottoms with rocks and sand in an almost biblical kind of way. And so it becomes, I think, to me, clear that we have to work on both these scales simultaneously. We got to do the right thing close to home because it is how we reestablish our connection with the world around us. But they don't call it global warming for nothing. If we can't, in the course of a few years, address this at the largest level as well, then our home places will be so overwhelmed that there'll be no preserving them no matter what. And so we are called also, and I think that this goes right back to the imagery at the very beginning of that speech from the Whirlwind. We're called also, and maybe almost for the first time, to really conceive of the place where we live as a planet as well. And there's those beautiful images when God is first taunting Job, can you tell me how the world was laid out and the morning stars singing for joy and things like that. Our ability to imagine ourselves on that very large scale is incredibly important to this work as well. One of the things, and here I'll just finish, that's important, and I probably will say this again tonight because it just sort of is occurring to me. One of the things that's important, and one of the places where I think Job is helpful, and maybe the Old Testament in general is kind of helpful here, is in the realization that we really may not win this fight. We have perhaps waited too long to get started. The science is certainly very dark and things are moving very fast. It's a bad sign when the biggest physical features on Earth are now broken, And yet there's something very consoling, too, in that deep and intimate relationship between God and the world and Job that allows us maybe to find some footing on which to stand as we fight a really desperate fight going forward. And I'll just end by saying the only thing that's kept me sane in the course of the last 20 years is engaging in that fight. So my advice would be you have two choices. One is to ignore all this evidence and all this beauty and all this new sort of emerging theology. One thing to do would be to just ignore it. Put it out of your mind, shut it out, look at other things. Because the only other alternative that will keep you sane, if you do look hard at where we are, if you do study the signs of the times, is to engage faithfully and sacrificially in the fight to actually do something about it. It is the fight of our time, and it may be the fight in a sense of all time, the biggest thing that humans have come up against, and because of its size, the perfect thing for us to think about in the kind of theological terms that I am so grateful for the four of you thinking about in ways that an amateur like myself really can't. Thank you guys so much for that work.
Wow, such beauty. Thank you. It's listed in the program now as discussion, and the panelists can certainly join in as well. But if people have responses, questions, comments to any of the panelists, we'd love to hear from you. There are microphones available. I invite you to keep your comments relatively brief so we can get to as many as possible, but we would love to hear from any of you who have used this book, The Comforting Whirlwind, in your classes, in your own work, how you have found it useful, anything you want to say to Bill McKibben about this work, or others as well. The Rolling Stone article, obviously, about the math is very compelling. So, please.
Thank you to all the panelists.
And please introduce yourselves also.
My name is Dan Spencer. I teach in the University of Montana, and we have a very large sustainable food and farming program there, and your book, Deep Economy, is part of our canon there. But I also teach the Comforting Whirlwind in a couple different classes, both the entry-level class and a graduate class, and it really provokes a lot of thought. But I have a somewhat different question to ask as a starting point about in terms of where we're going in terms of hope, and you're talking about working at multiple scales. Do you think there is still hope and worthwhileness to be investing at the international level, such as in the protocols? I mean, I've been talking to my students about what has happened with this agreement between China and the United States as a possible segue to something significant happening a year from now in Paris. But it's sometimes wonder if this is really a diversion, a distraction from the other work that we need to be doing. And I wonder if you or any of the panelists have thoughts on that.
I have a couple. I think it's a very good question. Look, the international process has been as futile as our national process so far. I mean, we've come close to starting something like the Kyoto Protocols 15 years ago, but they never really went anywhere. We never ratified them, nothing happened. And as you know, Copenhagen Conference 5 years ago was the biggest foreign policy fiasco since Munich. I mean, just a complete disaster. The reason for that is not because something broken in the international system. It's because the international system is simply a reflection of the politics of the member nations of those countries. And until those countries decide they want to do something, nothing will happen. The only way that those countries will decide they want to do something is when there are powerful movements demanding that change come. So that's why, for instance, we went and staged this march in New York in September, and there were smaller marches in 2,600 other cities that day too. But the one in New York was the focus because the world leaders were there at the UN. And it actually, in this case, made some difference. I mean, President Obama, who's not been very good on these things, it must be said, got up and gave a speech at the UN 2 days later saying when people march in those kind of numbers, and this was the biggest demonstration about anything in the United States in many years, we have to listen. And I think the accord with China, was in some measure a response to that emerging demand. Things like that are not enough. They are a start. We do need some kind of global framework if we're ever going to ratchet down carbon at the pace that we now have to. It was a very good sign that a developing country at least made the concession that its rise in carbon would have to come to an end at some point. A start. So we got to keep engaging on that level, but the way to do it is not to, go on and on about the UN process. The way to do it is to hold the fossil fuel industry's feet to the fire in as many places as you can. Not just in the United States, which I've been mostly talking about, but 350.org works in 188 countries. This divestment thing is going great guns around the world. So, dioceses, Anglican dioceses across Australia and Australian National University have divested in the last few months, and it's been a huge deal because that's the biggest coal country on earth, and it's caused huge furor there, as it should. Real searching re-examination of what's going on, and I could tell you stories like that all day. That's what it's going to take. If we put enough pressure into the system writ large, then things will begin to change. So more pressure of all kinds, please.
Please, Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Scott at Seattle University. I've been working in this field for a while, and I'm feeling a lot of grief and despair sometimes. And I know by looking at this stuff, it's a common feeling or understandable feeling. I wonder if we're a culture of denial, and therefore in a great deal of unresolved grief. Unresolved grief leads to being stuck in our personal lives. Is one of the church's call perhaps to create rituals of grief and really invite people into this, but also allow them to express that grief such that they can then also move through it to action? And if people are interested in talking with me about this piece of grief, I'd love to do that, but I also like to hear your thoughts, any of you five, about that. Thanks.
Everyone wants to hear from you.
Well, look, I'll just say I think it's, first of all, brother, it's good to see you, and so much good work for so long. Yeah, I mean, look, this is powerful and difficult material to delve into. I think that grief is one of the natural responses, and I think it would be good for churches in particular to figure out how to deal with that. I also think it's not the single biggest stumbling block, the thing that makes it hardest to act. I think the thing above all that makes it hardest to act is that the problem seems so enormous and we seem so small as individuals in comparison that it's hard to convince ourselves that anything we do actually matters. I've changed every light bulb in my house twice. We went to compact fluorescence, and now we're on LEDs, and when they invent the next thing, I'll get up on the chair and change them all again. It's a good thing to do, but I try hard not to fool myself that it's actually doing anything about climate change. I mean, the role of individuals is to become not individuals in this fight. It's to join together to make real systemic change against a structural problem. And one of the reasons, I mean, I want to hear what everybody else has to say about the role of the church, and I think that's really important. One of the reasons that we've organized movements the way that we have is to show that there's enough people engaged, enough size just of this thing that it becomes less futile seeming. You know, when we started 350.org, we really didn't have very many people around the world who were working on climate change. We couldn't have had a march of 400,000 people in New York. But we did know how to we had a few people all over the place. So what we started by doing was one day of action, and we had 5,000 some demonstrations in 181 countries around the world. And the pictures of those which we shared around the world began to allow people to see themselves as part of something larger. And now that's spreading. Now we really are acquiring critical mass. And I notice that as we do, it makes it easier for people to get beyond their despair, to feel a part of something that has a chance going forward. Just a chance, as I said, but that's a place where we weren't even 5 or 6 years ago.
I'll say a word. Thanks, Mike. Just a couple, thinking about that question, which I think is really important. Earlier this morning in one of the sessions, the question of how you frame climate change came up. And I think what this book on Job does is frame in a kind of idolatry framework. I mean, that we basically have taken on the role of God, which is a really important frame. I heard Anthony Lazerwitz of I think that's how you pronounce his name, of the Yale Climate Communication a couple weeks ago, and they did testing of different frames, what Americans respond to, and they found the frame of public health was the most helpful for cutting through partisan divisions, that everyone is concerned about people's health. And more, of course, we're seeing the effects of climate change as causing diseases, vector-borne diseases. He even told us about this one parasite, I think it was chickamauga or something, that I had never heard of, that was really scary. So, and there's other possible frames. I think the grief, stages of grief could be a frame that could really work. I also think we need to work on the frame of addiction, of simply over and over doing the 12 steps of saying we are addicted as a society to something and have to overcome this addiction. But there's, I think, multiple ways to frame it. I'm intrigued with the idea of also framing it biblically, like we've sort of been doing today. I mean, Bill talked about taking those rabbis to the top of the mountain and they say, oh, now I know how Moses felt. I was really moved with the Occupy Wall Street movement to see the golden calf one day, the big paper mache golden calf. I mean, I think the more we can draw connections between the terrible things we're doing economically, imperially, everything else, and Bible stories, use that Bible frame and the prophetic critiques of injustices that we've got running through the whole of Scripture to empower people to see this is unjust, this is ridiculous, this is crazy. Your use of decreation also, this is helpful. So among the multiple frames, grief, lament is certainly a classic biblical frame that absolutely is used by Jeremiah and many others, and it's God lamenting with us. We're not the only ones lamenting. I mean, God laments over and over, but then you have to move through that as well. That would just be a response. Ted, anybody? Next.
My name is Sarah Macias. I'm a senior MDiv student at Austin Presbyterian Seminary. So first I want to thank each of you for equipping us in particular ways so that we can all make a difference together. And I did enter seminary with a particular vocational interest in eco-justice. So, but the story of Job calling us to humility, calling Job to humility and joy, Kathryn made reference briefly to Job's daughters. And so there's an observation and a question that I've got. There's the observation that the relationship that Job has as from being transformed from this experience changes his relationship. I mean, this humility changes his relationship with those who matter to him, those relationships that don't have any names at the beginning and they actually have names and an inheritance at the end of the story. So it changes things radically. And so for those of us that are trying to find the particular words and stories and images to help people in the pews reimagine, how can we, what can we do to paint those pictures to help people reimagine the possibility of the joy that is available to us when we make some adjustments so that we can be in better relationship. I mean, thinking theologically and ecologically, it's all about relationships. So how can we help people see that there is an alternative and it's better? So that's, and Barbara, I think you touched on that already.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly. I think I didn't go much into that. None of us really did in the epilogue of Job. But you're right that somehow in that vision of the whirlwind speeches, Job is moved to joy or to live again. I mean, a lot of people don't like the epilogue. They think it's just kind of a anticlimactic. Job gets twice what he had and gets a new set of children and it can be read that way, and a lot of people do read it that way. I don't. I think Job in the epilogue has learned his place in creation, humanity's place in creation, and is called to joy and to delight and to freedom in living again after that great loss, after great tragedy. I owe a lot to Ellen Davis for that interpretation, of course, but she says, the most courageous thing Holocaust survivors ever did was to have children again. So the most courageous thing Job does is to have children again. And she says don't ask the question, what does it cost God to give children again, but what does it cost Job to have children again, even knowing the great cost and the great risk of having children in such a dangerous world. I think this could be a key. I think you're onto something there, and it addresses the last question about grief as well. But there may be a place for grief and for services of grieving and for lament, certainly. But I remember something you said at the last year's SBL, Barbara, I think, about preaching. And here's Barbara's and mine, Lutheran identity, the law and gospel dialectic there, that certainly law will take us to a certain point, and grief and such, but we have to preach gospel too in this, and I think that's what you're getting at, that we have to preach that there is joy in embracing this new reality and in becoming small again, that there's a real joy there and not the false joy that our society, that our culture tries to woo us into.
I have apologize. I didn't even see this microphone. I'm so sorry. I see 3 of you standing here. I do want to say President Lori Zoloff is in line too, and we have her to thank for being able to have Bill McKibben. So I want to say an SBL thanks to AAR, and you represent AAR. Thank you so much. So maybe all 3 of you want to do your question, and then we'll have a response from the panel. Would that be good? Since we only have a few minutes left, why don't we hear from all 3 of you? Thank you.
Okay, I'm David Ford from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and I'm taking part in the AAR panel tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in this room on the religion and the roots of climate change skepticism. And I'd be really interested here in the SBL to hear what each of the panel has to say about biblical eschatology, apocalyptic. We're talking about the future. What do you say about biblical scenarios of the future, and what are your responses to them?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Ian Meverak. I'm a PhD student at Boston University and an alum of Middlebury College. I have a couple questions, but I'll try to make them quicker. I'm glad also to hear from Ched Myers, because Tevin East was performing Leaps and Bounds at my church, and ever since then I was thinking about watershed discipleship and all of that, and hearing this wonderful panel, I was hearing a new kind of nature spirituality, a different cosmology, and how is that going to then affect how we think about church and what we do with that. I've been hearing ever since I've been a young Christian into the environmental movement, this whole idea, and then people will return to the churches. Once the churches care about the environment, then they'll become popular again, and we'll be back in the 70s, and the pews will be full. But I don't think that's going to happen. What are the new forms of spiritual community that this new cosmology and this new spirituality are calling forth? I'm really trying to experiment, discover that. Is it watershed-based? Is it a kind of activist, street-based community? What are we really being called into? And that's just the question I'm experimenting with.
I am Lori Zoloff of the AR, and I came to say thank you to this extraordinary panel. Those were beautiful papers, and it's a beautiful book, and well-deserved responses. So thank you very much for doing this panel. And I came to give you a little bit of hope. There's something beyond light bulb changing, and it's being in the institutions that we are and knowing our power. The American Academy of Religion has divested from fossil fuels. We did that. Yay us, right? And SBL, you can do it too, right?
Right.
That's why I came, you can do it, SBL. And I'm going to call it my presidential address tomorrow on a series of big challenges for the SBL and the AAR to work together, because we have enormous power. We're the largest meeting of any humanities organization in the world right here. We're the biggest between us. Humanities academic organization, we cannot go to grief. We have to put up a fight first, and we can do it if we stand together. We have real power in each of our institutions, in each of your churches, in your synagogues, in the mosques, and in our universities. We have much more to say, and from the sources that you brought to us, those resources are there, and I really urge you to stand together at this big teach-in this weekend and really think carefully about the power that you do have, and let's seize it, let's do it. So thank you.
Oh, wow.
There's one more question, too.
Oh, there is another one? Oh, okay, Sylvia, please.
Okay, well,
So we'll have 4 questions here. Great. Sylvia Kiesmat works on
it's
Colossians.
kind of a question and a comment. I think one thing we've been exploring in biblical theology for the last little while is the importance of grief, and is the importance of lament as on the way to newness, right? I mean, this all comes out of Brueggemann. But in Romans 8, this is the other key text around creation in the New Testament, or one of them. You have that groaning of creation and the groaning of humanity and the groaning of spirit with creation. And it's out of bringing that pain to expression, which is what our grief is, right? We are grieving with what's going on with creatures and with the earth. And it's out of that grief that we find that deep place where there are symbols of hope. And I think our problem is we're having trouble finding those symbols of hope. And I think this is where the larger international movement and the local embodied place comes together. Because those places of hope are always on the ground, local embodied places of hope. And so we need to be acting on that large scale and telling the stories of the small farms in Vermont or Ontario. I'm a subsistence farmer as well as a New Testament scholar, so these are the stories I look for. And I think that when we're telling those stories and we're telling them alongside the people who are bringing the pain deepest to expression, which is our First Nations people. I was at the tar sands this summer on the Mackay First Nation, talking to people from the Athabasca First Nation, and they have a vision of what it can look like if the tar sands are stopped. And it's those stories of hope, I think, that need to be central as we're acting on these large levels in ways to protect their small places. So I think that larger biblical narrative provides the impetus for owning that grief as a way, as the place out of which that hope springs up, gushes forth.
Ted, do you want to respond? Thank you.
A part of the Bible we haven't talked about because we're focusing on Job are the apocalyptic texts. And in response to this question, my friend Tim Weiskell, whom I quoted, told me frequently, you Bible guys shouldn't be talking about creation, you should be talking about the apocalypse. And Barbara is probably more able to talk about that than anybody here because of her book on Revelation. So I'd just like to ask her to respond briefly to that question.
Well, I love talking about eschatology, so it's good we have 2 minutes left. The end is here. Almost here. And I just want to say, Lori, I'm so glad to hear you talk about AAR-SBL as a teach-in. I really think that is exciting. This is the room to come to for every session. Tomorrow at 11:45, your presidential address. Tonight at 7:45, Bill will be in this room, or 7:30. So let's make it a great, pardon me? Okay, yes, and there's another book panel in here, I think, this afternoon. So yes, all of us. Just briefly, and I really would love to talk to you some more. I think, and I guess I'm doing a thing tomorrow on preaching apocalyptic texts where I'm going to make the case that doom and gloom isn't what apocalyptic texts are about. And now as we lead up to Advent in the Christian lectionary, they just get worse and worse. But the end of the world is not about the end of time. I think, and I use empire critical work here to, which I think has been in both Hebrew scriptures and New Testament, to say the apocalypses are written in a context of imperial oppression, whether it was the Seleucids or Ptolemies or whoever, the book of Revelation, the Romans. And what apocalypses do is help people see the end, not of the world, the physical world, the planet Earth, but the end of the empire, and see a vision for hope beyond that. And I really think that that's the best way to read biblical eschatologies. We've totally gone nuts with thinking that salvation is a kind of heavenism, that our goal is to get off the earth and go to heaven and be with God. That is ridiculous theology, and I would say the best of biblical theology now is definitely critiquing that. There's nothing in the New Testament about going to heaven after you die, about escaping planet Earth. It's what Norman Hobble calls heavenism, and it's very dangerous theology. So I think there's other people working on eschatologies as well. I, of course, was distressed to see the survey this morning, that, what is it, 77% of Americans think the end times are coming closer. When you see evidence of climate change and that this is a sign that the apocalypse is happening, that's terrible theology. It just makes me realize how big our task is, and we've got to get moving on the teaching. Because New Testament eschatology is a different kind of vision of hope, and the book of Daniel as well. It's to help people who have lost a story or who are so held captive to the imperial story. And Ellen Davis does this with the Egypt story as well, you know, that Egypt is this iron smelting furnace. And apocalypses are narratives that give us a different kind of storyline, and I think eschatology really is an important task, so thank you. We're working on it. And anybody else? Ched? Kathryn? Bill, you better have the last word, okay? For the next 3 hours, then we'll hear you again.
All right, well, I'll just say very briefly, I loved that discussion of how we do have to do things close to home and in place, because that's where vision and hope come from. And then we need to be able to sometimes in the course of the year get everybody out of their particular place and come together in big, powerful actions that demonstrate things. And this goes to Ian's question about where church is, now. Right now today, and these are just a few that I know of. Right now today, there are about 20 people in jail in British Columbia, in Burnaby, for trying to block a huge pipeline to the West Coast. There's 5 or 6 people, including the really eloquent and wonderful Sandra Steingraber, in jail in the Finger Lakes for blocking attempt to do a huge fracking project in Seneca, New York. The same thing going on in Australia right now. I'll show some pictures tonight of some of the amazing. Look, one of the places in time of crisis where church is in jail, and one of the good things about being older, and I'm looking at the demographics of this room. One of the good things about being older, and one of the good things about having tenure, is at a certain point there's not a hell of a lot they can do to you. So we need you guys standing up seriously in all kinds of ways going forward. And those are some of the places I think. I remember being in jail on a Sunday morning with Jim in D.C., as 60 or 70 of us in a cell block, and I remember it being, we were singing hymns, and I remember it being one of the better Sunday mornings in a long time. So.
Let's thank Bill McKibben and all our panelists.